Shadows on the road. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light casting long shadows over the quiet suburban road. Cassandra Monroe, a distinguished 42-year-old woman with a powerful presence, exuded authority and grace. Tonight, however, she looked forward to a rare moment of peace. Cassandra, who had worked tirelessly to become the FBI's youngest female director, was heading home after another marathon day, filled with strategy meetings, counterintelligence briefings, and endless paperwork. Her sleek black sedan glided effortlessly through the empty streets, the hum of the engine the only sound. She was a striking figure. Her natural curls framed her face, her sharp eyes a testament to years spent navigating the labyrinth of the justice system. Cassandra was no stranger to adversity. Being a black woman in one of the country's most challenging roles came with its share of prejudice. Yet, she had fought every battle with poise and tenacity, proving her worth time and again. Her thoughts drifted to the evening ahead. A quiet dinner, maybe an hour spent immersed in her favorite poetry. She loved Langston Hughes. The cadence of his words always brought her solace. But as she rounded a curve, the flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror snapped her back to reality. Cassandra's brow furrowed. She checked her speedometer, well within the limit. She hadn't run a stop sign or broken any other traffic law. What now? She murmured, her voice tinged with irritation. Despite her doubts, she pulled over to the side of the road, rolled down her window, and waited. The officer who approached her car was tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform meticulously pressed. His nameplate read Officer Derek Simmons, but his expression was anything but professional. His face, lined with arrogance and hostility, betrayed no kindness as he leaned down, peering into Cassandra's car. "License and registration," he barked, his tone devoid of civility. Cassandra remained composed. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I've been stopped?" Officer Simmons smirked, ignoring her question. "Just routine. Let me see your license and registration." Cassandra nodded, her movements deliberate. She reached into the glove compartment, retrieved her registration, and handed it over along with her license. Simmons snatched the documents without so much as a glance at her. Instead, his eyes scanned her car's interior, lingering on the sleek dashboard and the designer handbag on the passenger seat. "This your car?" he asked, suspicion dripping from every word. "Yes, it is," Cassandra replied calmly. "Is there a problem?" Simmons didn't respond. Instead, he returned to his patrol car, leaving Cassandra waiting. She sat silently, her fingers drumming lightly on the steering wheel. She was no stranger to encounters like this. Being profiled for driving an expensive car wasn't new, but it never ceased to sting. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before Simmons returned. He handed back her license and registration, but didn't move aside. Instead, he placed his hands on the roof of her car and leaned in closer. "I'm going to need to see some additional ID," he said, his tone sharper now. Cassandra's patience wavered. "I've already provided my license and registration. May I ask why further identification is necessary?" Simmons sneered. "Because people like you don't usually drive cars like this. Now, unless you want me to bring you in, I suggest you cooperate." The words hit Cassandra like a slap. "People like you." The implication was clear, and the indignity of it burned. Yet, she refused to let anger cloud her judgment. Taking a steadying breath, she met Simmons' gaze with unwavering resolve. "Officer, I am well aware of my rights. I have provided the legally required documents. Unless you have a legitimate reason for further identification, I will not comply." Her calm defiance seemed to enrage Simmons. His face reddened, and his hand hovered dangerously close to his holstered weapon. "You're really trying my patience," he growled. "Step out of the car. Now." Cassandra's heart raced, but she kept her composure. She knew that situations like this could spiral out of control in an instant. Slowly, she reached for her phone and pressed a button to record the interaction. The quiet beep as the recording began was a small comfort. "I have complied with every legal requirement, Officer Simmons, she said firmly, unless you can articulate a valid reason, I will not exit my vehicle. Simmons slammed his hand on the roof of her car, his face twisted with fury. You think you're above the law, don't you? Well, let me tell you something. You're not. And I'll make sure you remember that. The threat was unmistakable, but Cassandra refused to back down. Years of navigating tense, high-stakes situations had prepared her for moments like this. She could see the raw anger in Simmons' eyes, but she also saw something else. Fear. He was losing control, and he knew it. Just as the situation threatened to boil over, a second set of lights appeared in the distance. Cassandra's relief was palpable as another patrol car pulled up. From it emerged a woman in her 50s, her uniform crisp and her demeanor authoritative. The badge on her chest read Captain Evelyn Hart. What's going on here, Officer Simmons? She demanded, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Simmons straightened, his expression a mix of defiance and apprehension. Routine stop, ma'am. The driver was uncooperative. Hart's sharp eyes moved from Simmons to Cassandra, who remained seated in her car. Something about Cassandra's calm presence seemed to catch her attention. Ma'am, is there a reason you're being detained? Hart asked. Cassandra finally allowed a hint of a smile to touch her lips. Captain Hart, I was stopped without cause, harassed, and threatened. I've provided all necessary documentation, yet Officer Simmons insisted on additional identification without justification. Hart's expression darkened. She turned back to Simmons. Is this true? Simmons stammered, trying to defend his actions. I was following protocol. She was acting suspicious. Enough, Hart snapped. She stepped closer to Cassandra's car. Ma'am, if you would, please step out and join me over here. Cassandra obliged, her movements deliberate, as she exited the car. Hart led her a few steps away, her tone softening. I'm sorry for any trouble caused tonight. May I ask your name? Cassandra extended her hand. Cassandra Monroe, Director of the FBI. Hart's eyes widened, and a ripple of recognition crossed her face. She turned to Simmons, who stood frozen, his face ashen. Officer Simmons, she said coldly, you've just made a grave mistake. The confrontation wasn't over, but Cassandra knew she had just taken the first step in a fight for accountability. As the stars glittered overhead, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was about more than one encounter. It was about the countless others who couldn't speak out. And Cassandra Monroe wasn't about to let their voices go unheard. The aftermath of power. The morning sun spilled across Cassandra Monroe's sleek kitchen, illuminating the understated elegance of her home. It was a space that reflected her personality. Minimalist yet commanding, every detail thoughtfully curated. Despite the warmth of the golden light, a storm brewed inside her. The events of the previous night lingered like an unwanted shadow. As the director of the FBI, Cassandra had faced her share of challenges, but the blatant racism and abuse of power she encountered at the hands of Officer Simmons had ignited a fire within her. Her phone buzzed on the counter, shattering her reverie. She picked it up to find several notifications, news alerts, emails, and texts from colleagues. Overnight, the body camera footage from the incident had been leaked, and it was already making headlines. The titles ranged from FBI Director Confronts Police Racism to Officer Faces Scrutiny After Altercation with Top Federal Official. Cassandra sighed. She wasn't surprised. The media loved a scandal, especially one that revealed systemic cracks in law enforcement. What concerned her was the broader implications of the situation. This wasn't just about her. It was about the millions of Americans who didn't have her platform, her resources, or her ability to fight back. She scrolled through the texts, pausing at one from her trusted deputy, Marcus Cole. Cassandra, we need to talk. This is bigger than we thought. Call me ASAP. Her stomach tightened as she dialed his number. Marcus picked up on the first ring, his voice low and serious. Director, have you seen the footage? He asked. I have, she replied, her tone measured. It's troubling, but not unexpected. Marcus hesitated before continuing. There's more. Simmons has a history, a string of complaints from civilians about excessive force and discriminatory behavior. It was swept under the rug every time. This could blow wide open. Cassandra closed her eyes, frustration coursing through her. And now he's facing the wrong person, she muttered. How do we proceed? Marcus didn't hesitate. The department's internal affairs unit is already under pressure to investigate. The public backlash is growing, and they'll want to make an example of him. But Cassandra, this isn't just about one officer. Simmons is a symptom of a much larger disease. Later that day, Cassandra arrived at the FBI headquarters. The towering glass facade reflected the city skyline, a beacon of justice, or so it was supposed to be. Inside, her team was waiting for her. Marcus was at the head of the table, his usually composed demeanor replaced with a visible edge of concern. We've compiled a dossier on Simmons, he began as Cassandra took her seat. 36 civilian complaints in the past 5 years. 15 of those involved excessive force. The rest were for discriminatory remarks and harassment. Every single one was dismissed or resolved internally without consequence. Cassandra's jaw tightened, and the department's response, predictably defensive. Marcus replied. They've issued a statement claiming they'll conduct a thorough investigation, but we both know how these things go. Without external pressure, it'll be another cover-up. Cassandra leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. We need to ensure transparency. Reach out to the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. I want them involved from the start. Marcus nodded, but his expression remained grim. There's something else. This incident has sparked a broader conversation about systemic racism in law enforcement. Activists, media, and even some politicians are calling for your voice in this. They see you as a symbol of resistance. Cassandra sighed. I'm not here to be a symbol, Marcus. I'm here to do my job. But you are a symbol, Marcus insisted. You represent what justice should look like. Fair, equitable, and unyielding. If you speak out, you could inspire real change. The following day, Cassandra sat in her office, drafting a public statement. Words came easily to her, but the weight of their significance bore down heavily. She knew this wasn't just about her experience. It was about the countless others who had been silenced or ignored. She had to strike a balance, acknowledging the injustice she faced while amplifying the voices of those without her platform. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Sheriff Evelyn Hart, the officer who had diffused the situation the night before. Cassandra answered, her voice calm but firm. Sheriff Hart, thank you for calling. I owe you that much, Hart replied, her tone filled with remorse. Director Monroe, I want to formally apologize for what happened. Officer Simmons' behavior was unacceptable, and I assure you, we are taking this matter seriously. Taking it seriously means more than just disciplining Simmons, Cassandra said. It means addressing the systemic issues that allowed someone like him to remain on the force for so long. Are you prepared to do that? There was a pause on the other end of the line before Hart spoke. I am, and I want to work with you to ensure real reform. Cassandra's lips curved into a small smile. Good. Because this isn't just about fixing one department. It's about setting a precedent for the entire country. By the end of the week, Cassandra's statement was ready. Standing before a podium at a press conference, she faced a sea of reporters and cameras. Her voice was steady as she began. Last week, I experienced firsthand what so many in this country face every day. Discrimination and abuse of power. While my position affords me the ability to fight back, I recognize that countless others do not have the same privilege. This is not just about one officer or one department. It's about a system that has failed to uphold the values it claims to protect. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in before continuing. As the director of the FBI, I have a responsibility to ensure justice. But justice is not a solo effort. It requires the collective will of law enforcement, lawmakers, and the public. Together, we must demand accountability, transparency, and reform. This is not just my fight. It is ours." The room erupted in applause, but Cassandra remained stoic. She wasn't here for accolades. She was here to make a difference. Behind the scenes, Cassandra worked tirelessly to push for change. She met with civil rights leaders, law enforcement officials, and policymakers, using her platform to advocate for comprehensive police reform. She knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with resistance, but she was undeterred. As the days turned into weeks, the fallout from the incident grew. Officer Simmons was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, and the department's internal practices came under intense scrutiny. Meanwhile, Cassandra's efforts began to bear fruit. New policies were proposed to increase accountability and reduce bias in policing. Despite the progress, Cassandra knew the fight was far from over. But as she sat in her office one evening, reviewing the latest reports, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had turned a moment of personal injustice into a movement for collective justice. And she wasn't done yet. The ripple effect. The wheels of justice, often slow and laborious, had begun to turn. Cassandra Monroe's name was now synonymous with both power and perseverance, her experience a rallying cry for those fighting against systemic injustice. Yet, as the media storm surrounding the incident intensified, Cassandra found herself navigating a new reality, a delicate balance between her responsibilities as the FBI director and her newfound role as a symbol of resistance. A tense meeting. 3 weeks after the confrontation with Officer Simmons, Cassandra found herself seated at the head of a long, polished conference table at FBI headquarters. Around her sat representatives from the Department of Justice, civil rights organizations, and local law enforcement officials. The air was thick with tension, a palpable reminder of the stakes involved. Deputy Attorney General Paul Bennett, a man known for his no-nonsense demeanor, leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "Director Monroe," he began, his tone clipped, "let's address the elephant in the room. Your public statement has galvanized a national conversation. Protests are springing up across the country. While your message was powerful, it's also inflamed tensions within law enforcement agencies. Many feel you've painted them all with the same brush." Cassandra met his gaze, her expression calm but resolute. "Mr. Bennett, my intention was not to vilify law enforcement, but to shine a light on systemic issues that have been ignored for far too long. If my words have made some uncomfortable, then perhaps it's time they examine why." The room fell silent. Some officials shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement. Cassandra continued, her voice unwavering. "We are at a crossroads. This isn't about one officer or one department. It's about a culture that tolerates prejudice and abuse of power. We have an opportunity to lead by example, to implement reforms that will rebuild public trust. But that requires all of us to confront some hard truths." A civil rights attorney, Aisha Grant, spoke next. "Director Monroe is right. This isn't a time for defensiveness. The data speaks for itself. Disparities in policing outcomes, excessive force complaints, racial profiling. These aren't isolated incidents. They're patterns." The discussion that followed was heated but productive. By the end of the meeting, a framework for a joint task force was in place, one that would focus on investigating discriminatory practices within law enforcement and proposing actionable reforms. Personal backlash. Cassandra's unwavering stance had earned her both praise and criticism. For every message of support she received, there was another accusing her of undermining law enforcement. Threats began trickling into her office, anonymous letters, emails, and even phone calls. Her security detail was increased, a stark reminder of the personal risk she now faced. One evening, as she returned to her home, a modern townhouse in a quiet Washington, D.C. neighborhood, she found an envelope taped to her front door. Inside was a handwritten note. "Stay in your lane, or you'll regret it." Cassandra read the note calmly, her expression unreadable. She handed it to the agent on her security detail, who immediately called it in. Moments later, Marcus Cole arrived, his face a mask of concern. "This is escalating," he said, pacing her living room. "We need to take this seriously." "I am taking it seriously," Cassandra replied, her voice steady. "But I won't let fear dictate my actions. These threats are proof that we're rattling the right cages." Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Just promise me you'll be careful. The world needs you, Cassandra." She smiled faintly. "I promise." Simmons' fall from grace. As Cassandra grappled with the personal fallout, the investigation into Officer Derek Simmons gained momentum. Internal Affairs, under mounting public and political pressure, uncovered a trove of damning evidence. Beyond the 36 civilian complaints already documented, they found instances where Simmons had falsified reports to justify his actions. In one case, he had planted evidence to frame a young black man, leading to a wrongful conviction that was overturned years later. The media seized on these revelations, and public outrage reached a fever pitch. Simmons became the poster child for everything wrong with modern policing. Calls for his termination and criminal prosecution grew louder. Sheriff Evelyn Hart, determined to salvage her department's reputation, held a press conference to announce Simmons' dismissal. Her tone was somber as she addressed the crowd. "Officer Simmons' actions were reprehensible and do not reflect the values of this department. We failed to hold him accountable sooner, and for that, I take full responsibility. This is a wake-up call, not just for our department, but for law enforcement everywhere." Cassandra watched the press conference from her office, her expression unreadable. She appreciated Hart's candor, but she knew that words alone wouldn't suffice. Real change required action, a national reckoning. The ripple effect of Cassandra's experience was felt nationwide. Protests erupted in cities across the country, from Los Angeles to Atlanta, demanding police reform. Activists used the hashtag #JusticeWithCassandra to amplify their message, turning her into an unwitting icon. In Congress, a bipartisan group of lawmakers introduced the Law Enforcement Accountability and Reform Act, a sweeping piece of legislation aimed at addressing systemic issues within policing. Among its provisions were mandatory body cameras for all officers, the establishment of a national database to track misconduct, and funding for community-led public safety initiatives. Cassandra was invited to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee. As she sat before the panel of lawmakers, cameras flashing around her, she delivered a powerful opening statement. "This moment is not about me," she began. "It's about the countless individuals who have been silenced, ignored, or brutalized by a system that claims to serve and protect. Reform is not anti-police, it's pro-justice. We must create a system that holds everyone accountable, from the highest-ranking officials to the beat officers on the street." Her testimony was met with applause from some senators and glares from others. But Cassandra didn't flinch. She knew that real progress required confronting uncomfortable truths. The personal toll. Amid the whirlwind of public appearances, policy discussions, and media scrutiny, Cassandra began to feel the weight of it all. She hadn't seen her parents in weeks, and her younger brother, Malcolm, had left her a series of concerned voicemails. "You're taking on the world, Cass," one of his messages said, "but don't forget to take care of yourself." Late one night, she called him back. They talked for hours, reminiscing about their childhood in Atlanta and the lessons their mother had taught them about resilience and integrity. By the time they hung up, Cassandra felt a renewed sense of purpose, a glimmer of hope. As the months passed, the seeds of reform began to sprout. The task force Cassandra helped establish released its first report, detailing systemic issues and recommending comprehensive changes. Several police departments voluntarily adopted the recommendations, while others faced pressure from their communities to follow suit. Cassandra knew the road ahead would be long and arduous, but as she stood in her office, gazing out at the city below, she allowed herself a moment of optimism. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, it felt winnable. And Cassandra Monroe was ready for whatever came next. The system unmasked. The nation was still buzzing with the fallout from Cassandra Monroe's confrontation with Officer Simmons. What began as a single incident on a quiet suburban road had unraveled into a nationwide reckoning. Protests were sweeping across cities, and Cassandra found herself at the center of it all, not by choice, but by circumstance. Yet she embraced the role, knowing that systemic change required voices like hers to push the conversation forward. The call for accountability. At FBI headquarters, Cassandra sat in her office, surrounded by her core team. Marcus Cole, her deputy, was pacing as usual, flipping through a dossier marked with a red confidential stamp. On the screen in front of them, a national poll showed a stark divide. While 67% of Americans supported police reform, a significant minority resisted, believing the movement was anti-police. "This isn't just about changing policies," Marcus said, his voice tinged with frustration. "We're up against decades of culture, one that resists accountability." Cassandra leaned forward, her hands clasped. "Culture changes when accountability becomes unavoidable. We have to make it clear that no one is above the law, not even the people sworn to enforce it." Marcus nodded, handing her the dossier. Internal Affairs finished their deep dive into Simmons' department. "It's worse than we thought. There's a culture of cover-ups, false reports, and outright corruption. It goes all the way to the top." Cassandra flipped through the pages, her sharp eyes scanning the damning evidence. There were records of complaints ignored, investigations halted, and officers quietly transferred to avoid scrutiny. She closed the dossier, her mind already strategizing. This isn't just about Simmons anymore. It's about dismantling an entire system of complicity. A meeting with the president. 2 days later, Cassandra was summoned to the White House for a private meeting with President Ellen Ruiz. The president, a pragmatic leader with a background in law, had been following Cassandra's journey closely. As Cassandra entered the Oval Office, she was struck by the gravity of the moment. The weight of the nation's future seemed to rest on the room's thick mahogany desk. "Director Monroe," President Ruiz greeted her warmly, motioning for her to sit. "You've managed to do what few others could, force this country to look itself in the mirror." "Madam President," Cassandra replied, "it's not about me. It's about the millions of people who have been failed by the system." Ruiz nodded. "And now we have to act. I've reviewed the task force's recommendations, and I want your input before I push for federal legislation." For the next hour, they discussed everything from mandatory body cameras to independent oversight boards. Cassandra emphasized the importance of addressing not just misconduct, but also the root causes of systemic bias. "The problem isn't just bad officers," Cassandra said. "It's the lack of accountability, the culture of silence, and the absence of meaningful training on de-escalation and implicit bias." Ruiz listened intently, taking notes. By the end of the meeting, she extended a hand to Cassandra. "Your voice is critical in this fight. Let's make sure it's heard." The investigation expands. Back at FBI headquarters, Cassandra's team worked tirelessly to expand their investigation. They combed through thousands of police records, interviewing whistleblowers, and uncovering patterns of abuse that spanned multiple departments. What they found was a systemic web of misconduct that included falsified arrest reports, planted evidence, and routine harassment of minority communities. One particularly damning case involved a black teenager named Jamal Porter, who had been wrongfully convicted of armed robbery based on falsified evidence provided by Simmons and his colleagues. Jamal had spent 3 years in prison before a nonprofit legal group secured his release. Cassandra personally reached out to Jamal's family, her voice heavy with apology. "No family should ever have to endure what you've been through," she told his mother, Evelyn Porter. "I promise you, we will hold those responsible accountable." The case became a rallying cry for the movement. Media outlets ran stories about Jamal, humanizing the statistics and bringing the systemic failures into sharp focus. Protesters chanted his name alongside Cassandra's, demanding justice for all who had been wronged. Opposition and betrayal. Not everyone was on Cassandra's side. Within her own agency, there were whispers of dissent. Some agents felt she was overstepping her bounds, accusing her of politicizing the FBI. One senior agent, Robert Hastings, openly challenged her during a meeting. "Director, with all due respect, your focus on this issue is distracting us from our core mission. We're the Federal Bureau of Investigation, not the Social Justice Bureau." Cassandra's response was swift and decisive. "Agent Hastings, our core mission is justice. If we ignore systemic abuses of power, we fail that mission. If you can't get behind that, I suggest you reevaluate your place here." Her words sent a clear message, but the opposition didn't end there. Anonymous sources leaked internal memos to the press, attempting to discredit Cassandra's leadership. Headlines accused her of bias and overreach, fueling the narrative that she was anti-police. The attacks were personal and relentless, but Cassandra refused to waver. "I didn't take this job to make friends," she told Marcus one evening. "I took it to make a difference. A public reckoning." As the investigation reached its peak, Cassandra held a press conference to unveil the findings. Standing at the podium, she addressed the nation with the same calm authority that had carried her through countless crises. "The evidence we have uncovered reveals a pattern of systemic failure," she began. "This is not about a few bad apples. It's about a culture that allows misconduct to go unchecked. Accountability is not optional. It is the foundation of justice." She outlined the proposed reforms: independent oversight boards, stricter hiring practices, and federal funding tied to compliance with anti-discrimination policies. The room erupted with questions, but Cassandra remained composed, answering each with precision. One reporter asked, "Director Monroe, do you believe these reforms will be enough to change the culture of law enforcement?" Cassandra paused, her gaze steady. "Culture doesn't change overnight, but this is a start. And if we don't start, nothing will change." A glimmer of justice. As the press conference ended, Cassandra returned to her office, exhausted but hopeful. A few hours later, Marcus entered with a rare smile. "You'll want to see this," he said, handing her his tablet. On the screen was a breaking news alert. Former officer Derek Simmons indicted on multiple counts, including civil rights violations and falsification of evidence. Cassandra read the headline twice, a sense of vindication washing over her. It wasn't the end, but it was a step in the right direction. A step toward justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been wronged by the system. She leaned back in her chair, staring out at the city lights. The fight was far from over, but tonight, for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. The system had been unmasked, and the nation was watching. Now it was up to her to ensure the momentum continued. And Cassandra Monroe was ready for the challenge. The anatomy of change. Cassandra Monroe's life had become a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and public appearances. The confrontation with Officer Derek Simmons was no longer just an isolated incident. It was now a turning point in the national dialogue about systemic racism and police reform. But as the country grappled with these issues, Cassandra knew the real work wasn't in speeches or headlines. It was in dismantling the structures that had allowed this injustice to persist. A new alliance. 3 months after the incident, Cassandra sat in a dimly lit conference room with an unlikely group of allies: civil rights leaders, police chiefs, academics, and lawmakers from both sides of the aisle. The meeting was part of a newly formed coalition, the National Task Force for Police Accountability and Equity. It was a bold initiative, one Cassandra had fought hard to create, aimed at tackling the systemic issues in law enforcement from multiple angles. At the head of the table, Cassandra addressed the group. "We're here because we agree on one fundamental truth. The system is broken. Fixing it requires more than policy changes. It requires a shift in mindset, a cultural reckoning." Reverend Elijah Carter, a prominent civil rights leader, nodded. "That's true, Director Monroe, but culture is one of the hardest things to change. Policies can guide behavior, but hearts and minds take time. That's why we need a multi-pronged approach," Cassandra said. "Accountability measures are essential, but we also need education, community engagement, and independent oversight. We need to rebuild trust, and that starts with transparency. The coalition spent hours debating the specifics of their plan. Cassandra pushed for federal mandates requiring all law enforcement agencies to adopt body cameras, use of force training, and anti-bias education. Others emphasized the need for restorative justice programs and community policing initiatives. By the end of the meeting, they had outlined a comprehensive strategy that would serve as a blueprint for reform. A day in court. As the coalition began its work, Cassandra turned her attention to the trial of Derek Simmons. The former officer had been indicted on multiple counts, including civil rights violations and falsification of evidence. For Cassandra, the trial was deeply personal, not just because of her own experience, but because of the countless victims whose voices had been silenced. On the day of her testimony, the courtroom was packed with reporters and spectators. Cassandra took the stand with the same poise and determination that had defined her career. Under questioning, she recounted the events of that fateful night, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Officer Simmons did not stop me because I was breaking the law," she said. "He stopped me because of the color of my skin." His actions were not those of an individual officer, but a reflection of a system that has failed to hold its members accountable. As she spoke, she could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her, not just watching, but listening. By the time she stepped down, the room was silent, the gravity of her words hanging in the air. Backlash and resilience. Not everyone welcomed Cassandra's efforts. Conservative pundits accused her of waging a war on law enforcement, while police unions launched a coordinated campaign to discredit her. The rhetoric was harsh, often veering into personal attacks. Cassandra's inbox was flooded with hate mail, and her security detail had to intervene more than once to address credible threats. But Cassandra remained undeterred. In one particularly heated television interview, she faced off against a retired police chief who argued that her reforms were demoralizing officers and making communities less safe. With all due respect, Cassandra said, her tone measured but firm, "What's demoralizing is asking officers to operate within a system that sets them up for failure. Accountability isn't anti-police, it's pro-justice, and justice is what keeps communities safe." Her words resonated, but the attacks continued. Cassandra leaned on her inner circle for support, especially Marcus Cole, whose unwavering loyalty was a constant source of strength. "Don't let them wear you down," Marcus told her one evening after a particularly vicious smear campaign. "You're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for all the people who don't have the platform you do." Reform takes root. Months turned into a year, and the coalition's work began to bear fruit. Several cities adopted the task force's recommendations, implementing sweeping changes to their police departments. One such city was Atlanta, Cassandra's hometown, where her brother Malcolm had become an outspoken advocate for reform. "Seeing this happen here means everything," Malcolm told her during a visit. "It's like we're finally being heard." Nationally, the Law Enforcement Accountability and Reform Act gained traction in Congress, thanks in large part to Cassandra's advocacy. The bill included provisions for mandatory body cameras, independent oversight boards, and federal grants tied to compliance with anti-discrimination policies. While the legislation faced fierce opposition, public support was overwhelming, and Cassandra testified before Congress to make the case for its passage. "Reform isn't about punishment," she told the committee. "It's about building a system we can all believe in, a system that protects the rights and dignity of every person it serves." The weight of leadership. Amid the victories, Cassandra grappled with the personal toll of her work. She often worked late into the night, her desk piled with reports and proposals. The weight of her responsibilities was immense, but she refused to let it overwhelm her. One evening, as she prepared to leave the office, Marcus stopped by her door. "You've done more in the past year than most people do in a lifetime," he said, "but you're only human, Cassandra. Don't forget to take care of yourself." She smiled faintly. "I'll rest when the work is done." "The work will never be done," Marcus replied gently. "But you'll be no good to anyone if you burn out." His words stayed with her, and she made a conscious effort to carve out moments of rest. She reconnected with her family, spent time reading her favorite poetry, and even took a weekend to visit the Blue Ridge Mountains, a place she had loved as a child. These small reprieves gave her the strength to keep going. A turning point. A year after her fateful encounter with Officer Simmons, Cassandra stood on the steps of the Capitol, addressing a crowd of thousands. The Law Enforcement Accountability and Reform Act had just passed both houses of Congress, a landmark achievement in the fight for justice. "This is not the end," she told the crowd, her voice ringing out with conviction. "This is the beginning. Real change takes time, effort, and courage. But today, we've shown that it's possible." The crowd erupted into applause, and Cassandra felt a surge of hope. She had set out to make a difference, and now, for the first time, she could see the impact of her efforts. As she looked out at the sea of faces, she knew the road ahead would still be challenging. But she also knew she wasn't walking it alone. Together, they were building a future where justice wasn't just an ideal but a reality, and Cassandra Monroe was determined to see it through. Legacy of justice. The air was crisp, carrying with it the subtle scent of autumn leaves. Cassandra Monroe stood on the steps of the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial in Washington, D.C., gazing at the towering likeness of a man who had inspired generations. Behind her, a diverse crowd of thousands gathered for the first annual National Justice Summit, a culmination of efforts from activists, law enforcement, and lawmakers to address the systemic challenges plaguing the justice system. The summit marked a full year since the Law Enforcement Accountability and Reform Act had been signed into law, and Cassandra had been invited to deliver the keynote address. But this wasn't just an opportunity to celebrate progress. It was a chance to reflect on the work that still lay ahead. A moment of reflection. As she waited to take the stage, Cassandra thought about how far they'd come. Her confrontation with Officer Derek Simmons had set off a chain reaction that revealed the extent of systemic corruption and prejudice in law enforcement. The backlash had been fierce, but the momentum for change had been even greater. Cassandra's role had evolved over the past year. She was no longer just the director of the FBI. She was a symbol of resilience and hope. But with that role came immense pressure. Every decision she made was scrutinized, every word dissected. Yet, she had learned to embrace the weight of responsibility, drawing strength from the people who had been inspired by her journey. One such person was Jamal Porter, the young man whose wrongful conviction had been exposed during the investigation into Simmons' department. Jamal was now an intern at a nonprofit organization advocating for criminal justice reform, and he often credited Cassandra for giving him the courage to share his story. "Your fight gave me my life back," he had told her during one of their conversations. "I want to make sure no one else has to go through what I did." The speech. When the time came, Cassandra stepped up to the podium. The crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on her. She paused, letting the weight of the moment settle before speaking. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice clear and steady. "Today, we gather not just to reflect on what we've achieved, but to reaffirm our commitment to justice, equality, and accountability." She looked out at the sea of faces, some holding signs that read "Justice for All" and "Accountability Now." "A year ago, I stood before Congress to advocate for the Law Enforcement Accountability and Reform Act. I spoke not just as the director of the FBI, but as someone who had experienced the failures of our system firsthand. Today, I am proud to say that we've taken significant steps forward. But let me be clear, our work is far from over." Cassandra went on to outline the successes of the past year. The establishment of independent oversight boards, the implementation of mandatory anti-bias training for law enforcement, and the creation of a national database to track police misconduct. These changes had already led to a measurable decline in excessive force complaints and an increase in public trust. "But numbers only tell part of the story," she continued. "The real change comes from the people. People like Jamal Porter, who turned his pain into purpose. People like Sheriff Evelyn Hart, who chose accountability over complacency. and people like each of you, who continue to demand better from our institutions." The crowd erupted into applause, but Cassandra raised her hand to signal that she wasn't finished. Change is not easy. It requires persistence, courage, and sacrifice. And while we've made progress, we must remember that justice is not a destination. It's a journey. It's a promise we must keep, not just for ourselves, but for future generations. Her voice softened as she concluded. Dr. Kane once said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But it does not bend on its own. It bends because of people like you. People who refuse to accept injustice as the status quo. Together, we will continue to bend that arc, no matter how long it takes." The crowd rose to their feet, their applause thunderous and sustained. Cassandra stepped back from the podium, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and humility. This moment wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had fought alongside her. Behind the scenes, later that evening, Cassandra attended a private reception for the summit's organizers and key participants. The atmosphere was celebratory, but Cassandra used the opportunity to discuss the next steps with her allies. Marcus Cole, her trusted deputy, approached her with a glass of champagne. "You really outdid yourself today," he said with a grin. "I think you might have even inspired the skeptics." Cassandra chuckled. "Let's hope so. We need every ally we can get." They were soon joined by Reverend Elijah Carter, who had been instrumental in rallying faith-based communities to support the reform movement. "Director Monroe," he said, his tone warm, "you've done something extraordinary here, but I suspect you're already thinking about the next battle." "Always," Cassandra replied. "We've made progress, but the work is never done. I want to focus on expanding restorative justice programs and addressing racial disparities in sentencing. The criminal justice system is a web, and we've only untangled one thread." Reverend Carter nodded. "Count me in. This isn't just your fight, it's ours. A personal victory." The following week, Cassandra visited Atlanta to attend a town hall meeting hosted by her brother, Malcolm. The event brought together community leaders, law enforcement officers, and residents to discuss the impact of the reforms and identify areas for improvement. As Cassandra watched Malcolm moderate the discussion, she felt a deep sense of pride. He had always been passionate about justice, but now he was channeling that passion into action. After the event, they sat together on a park bench, reminiscing about their childhood. "Mom would be so proud of you," Malcolm said, his voice tinged with emotion. "You've changed the world, Cass." Cassandra smiled, her eyes glistening. "She'd be proud of us both. You're the one bringing these changes home." They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of their shared journey hanging between them like a tangible thread. For Cassandra, moments like these were a reminder of why she fought so hard. Justice wasn't just an abstract ideal. It was about people, families, and communities. The path forward. As the months turned into years, Cassandra continued to lead with the same determination and integrity that had defined her career. She knew the fight for justice was an ongoing battle, but she also knew that progress was possible. Every policy implemented, every life changed, and every injustice addressed was a step closer to the world she envisioned. On her last day as FBI director, Cassandra packed up her office, reflecting on the legacy she was leaving behind. She wasn't done fighting, far from it, but she was ready for the next chapter. As she walked out of the building, she was greeted by a group of young activists holding a banner that read, "Thank you for bending the arc." Cassandra smiled, her resolve as strong as ever. The road ahead was long, but she was ready to keep walking it, one step at a time.